back. This is the last one. So I'm going to tell you right now, this is different. I'm not going to be lecturing at you. You are going to have to write and think. If you have not read the readings for today, read them first and come back to this. If you are exhausted and don't have the bandwidth to think and write and type, come back to this later. It's not that it's necessarily super intense, but you're going to have to actually put thought into your responses. None of the questions I'm going to ask you are going to require more than a few sentences or a paragraph at most. But if you just don't have it in you right now, then come back to this later. Do it tomorrow or something. That's okay. So your voices book, as you might have realized, they're basically case studies. They're experiences written by people who have mental illnesses or who take care of people with mental illnesses. And so these chapters aren't written by sociologists or researchers. They're just written by people who have experiences. We are going to apply course concepts to these first person accounts. And so whenever I do this segment of lecture, whenever you have these readings due, you can expect that you'll have read, and then I will ask you some discussion questions that you will respond to, excuse me, using PlayPosit and typing your responses. Some of the questions will be for accuracy. Some of them I'll have you go and find quotes, for example. So I'll tell you towards the end of this segment, you will have to go find some quotes. The first few questions I ask you are totally opinion-based. Towards the end of this segment, the questions are opinion-based, but also could be wrong. And so you'll see a variety like that. Whenever we talk about the voices reading, I'm not going to be necessarily lecturing the way that I did earlier. I will just be asking you to just think through it, and I'll have some discussion questions. So like I said, if you feel like you don't really have the bandwidth to read and write right now, it's okay. It's not that it's super, super intense, but you are going to have to write. So come back to it later if you're not in a headspace. And you can always pause and come back later too, I believe. So the first thing that I want you to do is just write a quick summary of each reading. Again, just a sentence or two, 3 at most is fine. What was Eden Express about? Mark Vonnegut's story, The Eden Express. And then what was Ellen Sachs's story, The Center Cannot Hold, about, in your own words? Okay, so I already said this. Don't do this unless you have read the readings and you're in the mood to write and think. If you're not there right now, it's okay. Just come back later. So the first one we're going to talk about is The Center Cannot Hold. The questions I'm going to ask you about this reading will really just be thought-provoking questions. There's no right answer. You don't have to write an essay. A few sentences or a paragraph is okay. I just want you to show me your thinking. So The Center Cannot Hold is about an extremely accomplished woman who is in Kleinian style therapy, and she has extreme separation anxiety from her therapist. So Ellen submitted a PhD level thesis to Oxford. She attended law school at Yale. She did all of this while experiencing severe psychosis, at times being arrested and threatening physical violence towards multiple people. But nobody knew but her therapist and her therapist's husband. Again, PhD level thesis, law school at Yale. This could be your doctor, this could be your professor, your TA, your coach, your lawyer if you ever need one. And so I want you to actually think, not in like a politically correct way, but like genuinely, if you were to find out that Ellen Sachs was your professor or your medical doctor, how do you think you would feel about that? What would come up for you? Okay. So now I want you to just take a second and read the following quote from The Center Cannot Hold. Okay, so the question I have for you is, so Ellen, it's not that she's saying, I'm not thinking about killing kids and burning worlds and destroying cities. She's saying like, yeah, I'm thinking about these things, but I know not to talk about them. And so knowing what to talk about and knowing what not to talk about can allow mental illness to go undetected. To what extent do you think Ellen is mentally ill if nobody is aware? Can you think of any mental illnesses that it cannot exist unless other people know about them? Okay, so those were just some questions. Again, this is that's kind of what I mean. I asked you a few questions. There's no wrong answer. As long as you put thought into it, bam, you got it right. So now we're going to dive into Eat and Express, the Mark Vonnegut story. So a matter of fact, a very matter of fact account of a drug trip gone seriously wrong. Now, the next few questions I'm going to ask you are going to be opinion-based, but you're going to have to pull from lecture. At the very end, I'm going to have you find some quotes. Trust me when I say, I mean, maybe you don't know me well enough to trust me yet, but I will tell you that this will help with the exam. This is not just busy work. Whenever I give you the exam, you will be expected to apply course concepts to these readings. So think about like lectures are giving you the information and the Voices textbook is your way of applying the information. So come exam time, you're gonna have to be familiar with both. So you will end up using this. I don't believe in busy work at all. Like actually, I think it's really disrespectful. So I would never have you do busy work. This will actually help you. All right. So with Mark's behavior, one of the main ways that he knew he was going mad is he was hearing voices. So insistent voices and visions that dictated his behaviors were the central manifestations of his quote unquote madness. So take a second and think about why hearing voices as a major determinant of whether someone's mentally ill or not. Why am I bringing that up? So this class is sociology of mental illness. Why do I think that hearing voices is, hearing voices as a sign of mental illness? Why would that be interesting? Think about that and then answer these questions. So can you think of any times in history when hearing voices and having visions was not seen as proof of mental illness? So what about prophets? Every major religion, maybe every religion, exists because of people who saw visions and heard voices. Am I wrong? I mean, prophets are essentially people, and they're saying, they spoke to God. I'm not doubting them, but it's also true that prophets are people who saw things that other people could not see and heard things that other people could not hear. And so whenever we look at Mark's experience as somebody who knew that he was going mad because he was seeing and hearing things, well, seeing and hearing things is the only reason why we have major religions. Again, this is the social construction of mental illness. I'm not saying that hearing voices and seeing things should or shouldn't be a symptom. I'm just pointing out that depending on when you were born, seeing and hearing things can either get you locked up in a psych ward or it can get you praised as a prophet. Harriet Tubman. Now, you guys might not all know this, but you all know who Harriet Tubman is, and if not, then send me an email so I know that, because if that would be helpful to know if I'm making an incorrect assumption. Harriet Tubman helped free enslaved people by using what was called the Underground Railroad, which is basically just a path to get a route to get enslaved Black people to freedom, to the north, to Canada, away from slave states. Harriet Tubman was hit with a paperweight. I believe it was lead, I could be wrong, was hit with a weight by her enslaver. It was only after she was struck in the head that she began hearing these voices that told her that she had to free the slaves. She began hearing visions and seeing things that she says is how she knew how to free them. Now, today, if we heard if someone says, I'm hearing voices and I'm seeing things that's telling me to save the world, you'd be like, that person is a little, ooh. But Harriet Tubman, one of the heroes of history, attributed all of the people she saved to hearing voices and seeing things. So the reason why I think this is interesting to point out in a class about mental illness, about the sociology of mental illness, is that hearing voices and seeing visions, nowadays we would say, yeah, that person is quote unquote loony, is mentally disturbed. But we have countless families that are now existing because they were freed, because Harriet Tubman saw things. We have major religions because some old guys saw and heard things. So again, that's what I mean by the social construction of symptoms. Now, take a moment to think about the role of culture in Mark's story. How did the culture impact the setting that Mark found himself in to begin with? How did culture impact the length that it took his friends to seek help for him? Finally, this is the last one for this slide. How did culture impact the ideas that his friends had on how to help him? Again, like I said, there's only a wrong answer. Reading. If you did the reading and you're looking at the book, you got these right, you're doing fine. So these aren't necessarily difficult questions, but they're going to make you think. Okay, so some examples that I have, and I'll do this where I'll ask you the question and then I'll give you a sense of what I was thinking, just to kind of like let you know whether you're on the right track or not. And if you feel like you're totally off base, reach out to me and let's chat. I love chatting with you guys. So this was about a drug trip. This man was tripping, but like in like the worst way possible. But the thing is, the culture at the time, it wasn't that, you know, he did this terrible thing and he's this drug addict who can't be trusted and his friends are at their wits' end. They were all tripping. He was the one who it impacted his brain chemistry a bit different. But the culture of the time, it's the 60s, man. You know, the culture at the time was very accepting of the drugs that Mark was doing. Not only were these drugs okay, but they were encouraged. So part of his support system were people who were also engaging in the same behavior. Historical trends. Again, the idea that in this time frame, everybody was doing hallucinogens. Everyone's doing LSD and acid and shrooms. And the worldview also influenced. I mean, him and his friends were doing drugs for days and days in a barn. Nobody called the cops on them. No nosy neighbor came over and said, hey, I can tell you guys are over here smoking that wacky tobacco. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was totally fine. They were isolated, pretty much left alone outside of Mark running around naked, and, you know, that causing a disturbance. But the way that Mark even ended up in his situation of having, you know, done this drug trip surrounded by friends was partially because it was easy to access those drugs. It was encouraged for him to do it. And there really was no legal repercussion for it happening at that time, which then also relates to how long it took his friends to get him help. It took forever because they were resistant to treatment and they were rejecting medicalization. There was a mistrust of the government. So the social integration seemed to be a bit off there with their community. And they felt that they could fix him by talking to him, by having him drink herbal teas. So medication, whereas today you have somebody go 3 days without eating after doing acid, they're going to get taken to the hospital. Them, I think he was with his friends for, it was like a week or something like that. It was a while, but they tried alternative treatment methods before finally saying this guy is going to die if we don't get him to a hospital. So the treatment that they chose for him, the length of time that it took them to take him to a hospital, the reason he was tripping anyways, all of this was influenced by the culture at that time. Now take a moment to reflect on Mark's reasoning for wanting to commit suicide. One, now this is the one that is you can get this one wrong answer. This is a true or false, or this is a, you know, right or wrong. What was Mark's reason? Why did Mark want to commit suicide? Okay, so Mark believed that suicide was a logical response to an overpopulated, overburdened planet. Mark's reason wasn't that he's just suffering so badly that he has to put an end to it. Mark was like, I mean, I'm kind of chilling, but like this world it sucks and I'm polluting it. And like, if I kill myself, then like the world will be better off. But it wasn't in like a melodramatic, sad person way. It wasn't the world is overpopulated, I can be a solution. This is interesting because the way that we understand suicide, for the most part, in our present day society, is that people use suicide as a way to end their suffering. Mark viewed suicide as a way to decrease the suffering of others that's not related to his own suffering. So in your own personal opinion, I'm curious what you guys think. Do you think Mark's reason is more or less sane than the quote unquote normal reasons that we think people commit suicide? All right. One last slide. This is it. You're doing great. I told you this was coming, so you shouldn't be too surprised. All right. Now what I want you guys to do, I want you to go into your reading, go into the Eden Express, and I want you to find one direct quote. It can be one sentence. I don't care. Guys, I don't care how long it is. One quote that's an example of the importance of culture and excuse me, the importance of culture and Mark and social support and maintaining wellness, the importance of social circumstance and Mark receiving treatment for his mental illness, and the relationship between Durkheim's suicide in this reading. So sorry, that might have been a little bit confusing. Basically, just go through your book and find one quote that's an example of culture in the reading, social circumstance in the reading, and Durkheim's suicide, which social ties. It's basically what I'm asking you to do. Okay, go ahead. All right. So I want to tell you guys, it's okay if you found totally different quotes. There's no reason we needed to find the same quotes here, but if you struggled with this, I wanted to at least give you an example. So here are some quotes that I found. Whenever I read this quote, I thought culture. Okay. Quote, what could they do? Putting someone in a nut house isn't a nice thing to do to someone. Excuse me. There are lots of pressures in the hip community that make that sort of decision even harder to come to than normally. Doctors don't know anything. Mental hospitals are repressive, fascist, etc. Hippies are supposed to be able to take care of their own. Schizophrenia is a sane response to an insane society. Mental illness is a myth. The Sanskrit word for crazy means touched by the gods. So this is an example of a quote, a little thick, but a quote that signals culture. This is about culture. And remember, our lectures today were about social circumstance, social ties, culture, identity, characteristics, and this quote screams culture. Okay, I found a quote that speaks to circumstance. Mark says, all the other patients fit neatly into my idea of what mental hospitals were about. They were all victims one way or another. They had been dealt, and I italicize this myself, lousy parents, lousy jobs, lousy marriages, lousy friends, lousy education. What we talked about earlier, guys, unreasonable parents, oppressive work conditions, unequal marriages, low social support, overdiagnosing of children in the education system. These are all examples we talked about today. And then we go to this reading and bam, there it is. A first-person account that speaks directly to what we lectured about earlier. It's a great quote. I'm curious what you guys found. And then social ties. Mark, whenever they finally took him to the hospital, I'm sorry to laugh. I laugh a lot, guys. I'm sorry. I like to laugh. I probably seem crazy because I'm like laughing to myself right now, but hopefully you're laughing too, at least once over the past hour or two. Okay, so quote, Simon and my father couldn't go the whole way to the mental hospital with me. In a way, it was a relief not having allies anymore. Now, if I fucked up, I fucked up on my own. Remember, social ties. Why are married people with kids less likely to commit suicide than unmarried people without kids? Because those social ties make you feel responsible, make you feel obligated. And so what Mark is saying now is, now that I don't have these social ties, I can screw up because there's nobody here that I have to worry about. Now I can commit this act of suicide because if I do this, there's nobody that's going to be affected by it. Mark probably never read Durkheim's 1897 book Suicide, right? But what he's talking about is exactly what Durkheim found. Those social ties decrease the likelihood of suicide. Okay. If this was a bit much for you guys, or if this was very unfamiliar, it's the first day. We're going to be doing things like this in the future. I'll lecture like I did earlier. I'll give you some more like, typical readings and articles and such, and they'll be good. But I'll also have you read chapters in your book. And when you read the chapters in your book, we're going to chat. You're going to write your thoughts. I'll have a couple questions, like the question about why did Mark consider suicide? If you said because he was miserable, that would be a wrong answer. But the question about, how do you feel about Ellen being your professor? Totally opinion-based. We will do more of these where you have to find your own quotes. And I promise you, this will come in handy for the exam. I will not steer you wrong. Okay. You guys did it. You made it through the first day of class. I'm so proud of you. I hope it was fun for me. Hopefully it wasn't like painful for you. Probably wasn't fun for you, but hopefully it didn't suck. Okay, Thursday, defining mental disorders. We'll do more on the illness experience. You have a few more readings from here on Thursday, and we'll do something like this again. You have the unwelcome center, denial, and addiction. They're good. I think they're good. And on Sunday, you'll have your first assignment due. I will get that posted to you by Thursday, end of day. The fact that I'm posting it as late as Thursday means it won't take you very long. And then your syllabus quiz is due end of day on Sunday as well. If you need anything at all, let me know. I am here for you. Killer job today, guys. You have made me very proud.